So first of all, thank you, Carl and Aligned, for inviting me to sharpen your skills. I'll do my best to make the next 30-45 minutes enjoyable, and I hope you don't steal the cheese, because then you will get smashed on your fingers. I would be delighted if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn or just follow me. So now let's have a look at the agenda. And for your convenience, I've placed the QR code there, so you can just scan it. It will be on the next page as well. The agenda, what I have in mind to talk about today. So first of all, is Agile a magic silver bullet? Secondly, keep the overlords happy to avoid Agile. The Agile scope, how ambitious are you? And then I will touch base on requirement traceability, which I've seen is a challenge in some Agile implementations. And documentation, it can actually be a potential source of waste if you don't get it right. And lastly, are your software development procedures compliant? That's a trick question, but stay tuned. Of course, it's not my intention to hurt feelings, but I might step on toes, because I've learned the hard way that talking about Agile can trigger feelings. And that's not what I have in mind, but I'm mindful about that. However, I also hope to spark ideas which eventually mean work for you. But if I do that, I think that's a positive outcome of this webinar. This webinar is not only about me talking, but you can also ask questions in the chat, as Carl just mentioned, and I will pause throughout the presentation and actually reach out to you, Carl, and check if there are questions. So you don't have to wait to the end. So just fire at will and fire away questions. So now let's get started. A common misconception is that implementing Agile fixes all problems in the world. And the question is that so? Well, no. If you struggle with lousy organization or how to manage requirements, Agile will not help. It will just make your life more troublesome. It's like buying a new car. It will not make you a better driver. It's fun initially, but when you realize your driving skills are as bad as before, you have spent much money and energy without fixing your actual problem. So I bumped into this LinkedIn post actually 2 years ago, and I fully agree with Kleber Sotte. Agile does not fix poor leadership, poor management, lack of engagement, political games, people's ego. The list is long. So, well, no, Agile is not a magic silver bullet. You can't fix things which is not there anyway. So you need to address your root causes before you try to apply Agile. I checked the post last week and found that I received 1,068 comments. I think that's amazing. I would be happy if my post got that response. But unfortunately, many of the comments were rather aggressive, accusing Mr. Sotte of not understanding Agile or confusing Agile with Scrum and so on. Well, Scrum is one way to implement Agile. It's not one or the other. But 1,068 comments, some of those were aggressive. So what I would like to encourage you is to avoid getting stuck in discussions on strict definitions of method and terms, because I found this a pitfall in many Agile implementation, holding you back from success in your implementation work. Of course, you should agree within the organization, but avoid becoming too rigid. Work together and compromise on your way forward, because otherwise, your discussions on Agile implementations won't be better than those of hardcore QA people arguing that everything must be documented on paper using a typewriter. And that isn't that helpful. I hope you agree. Well, I just mentioned QA, which brings me to the next topic I would like to bring up, roles and responsibilities. Finding quality and regulatory as defined roles in an organization is very common. Unfortunately, they often act as overlords that must be pleased, and when pleased, they will bless the next software release. Such an approach will inevitably not support Agile ambitions and will likely result in Agile approach to software development. And the Agile approach is a common pitfall you should avoid to the best of your abilities, because that could be you bring out the worst of both situations. You can have an Agile implementation, this case with Scrum, ending up with a waterfall approach at the end where QA will verify and perhaps fail you. And then there's a document review and there's perhaps a regulatory pass. And you need to have these in steps after you actually have developed your software. And this approach is, it would cause delays, and it would cause a lot of annoyance within the organization. So am I pointing fingers at QA and regulatory? No, this is just a symptom of something not working as it should. Quality and regulatory should be invited to the party much earlier, and their input should be valued as any other requirements. And this is where two more overlords play a crucial role. Assuming a Scrum approach, there is likely a Scrum Master and a product owner. I would say they are responsible for embracing the expectations of being a medical device developer. The objective of developing medical device software is to create safe products that meet an intended purpose. It is not only about adding new fancy features to demonstrate in the following demo. So in terms of pointing fingers, all roles are in the same bucket. It is a shared responsibility to make an Agile implementation successful. And again, I'm coming back to it is a team effort. A product owner must accept that the backlog will carry non-functional work items, excuse me, such as support for a regulatory submission. Likewise, QA and regulatory must accept that if they want something to be done, they must provide work items to be placed in the backlog. As indicated, I strongly suggest that the product backlog is a complete set of work items expected to be done in the development work or during the development work. And this includes inputs from regulatory and quality. For example, work required to support a regulatory submission, perhaps for a new market. I think these items should go into the product backlog. The planning phase is an excellent place to address compliance with your procedures and conduct several IEC 62304 planning activities. Even though quality and regulatory have contributed to the backlog, I suggest they assist in the planning phase. And there are actually two reasons for that. Firstly, the developers will better understand what a complete product means in the medical device industry. Secondly, you reduce the need for quality and regulatory to be annoying after the development work has finished. And not annoying because they want to, but because there are things you must get right to place a medical device product on the market. And now I'm not pointing finger at regulatory and quality to being annoying, but if the information comes too late, well, it will cause annoyance. If your organization splits function into different departments, please ensure that the Scrum team, in this case, well, there can be different Agile implementation. I've just chosen Scrum in this case as an example. But please ensure that the Scrum team is staffed with personnel from all relevant departments to enable quick feedback. Because you don't want the feedback, as I showed before in the Agile approach, you don't want the feedback after you've completed the work. You want it as quick as possible. So, for instance, integrating people from quality regulatory in the work. So include a sufficient testing capacity within a sprint, because if added later, I can almost promise you will lose speed and efficiency. So I would say it all boils down to Principle 5 in the Agile Manifesto. Build projects around motivated individuals, give them the environment and support they need, and trust them to get the job done. So this is really a co-work between the development people and quality and regulatory people. And that shouldn't be different groups. They should be working together throughout any Agile activities you have. I just want to mention one more overlord, the notified body, or perhaps I should say regulators. I often hear that all changes must be approved by a notified body, even for low-risk devices. I would say such an approach can be a party pooper for any Agile ambition which strives for frequent releases. But as a rule of thumb, if you don't change functionality directly implementing or impacting your clinical performance or increasing your risk appetite, you should be fine to implement changes throughout the life cycle. So, well, that was a rule of thumb. It was not a promise, but to let's say, frame how much you can change, watch your clinical performance and your risk appetite. So if you stay within those boundaries, you should be good to go. Enough about the overlords. Carl, do we have any questions so far? I've shocked you now by asking a question to you.
No questions so far. I'm sure everybody are mesmerized.
Well, that's nice, or terrifying, perhaps. So now let's discuss the scope of your Agile ambitions. Perhaps your immediate response is, I want everything to be Agile. And I want you to be, you want to be release ready after every sprint. Well, it's a nice ambition, but before we jump to any conclusions, let's have a look at a few challenges that must be addressed, starting with the term release. A release is a particular version of a configuration item that is made available for a specific purpose. A configuration item is an entity that can be uniquely identified at a given reference point in time. And in IEC 62304, release for a specific purpose means the software is ready to be used at a higher level. You could say at the product level or system level. So this is what I call a system integration level, and it applies regardless of whether the software is integrated into a medical device or it's a medical device on its own, also known as SaMD. I expect to find some level of integration after an IEC 62304 release. And now let me explain why. A product release can be described as a three-step approach. It starts with a software release, followed by a design release, and lastly, a product release. And strictly speaking, design release and product release, well, at least design release is not defined anywhere, but I hope you shortly will see the point in having it. The main difference between a software and a design release is that the software release only considers software functionality. So things like instruction for use, technical description, or design validation are, strictly speaking, not part of an IEC 62304 release. Yet, they must be included in a complete release. So, and the difference between a design release and a product release is that it often involves interactions with regulators. So even if your product is ready for launch, you can't place it on the market before it has been blessed by relevant regulators, such as receiving a 510(k) clearance from the FDA or a green light from a notified body. And this can take quite a long time to get to that point. And if worse comes to worse, you perhaps want to launch at different markets. That makes it even more complicated. So when looking at the scope of your Agile ambitions, how far do you want to take it? I believe using one of the three release steps is wise when defining the boundaries of your Agile ambitions, because each step can be explained with precise inputs and outputs based on your organization's needs. And also, when considering the Agile scope, be aware that the further you go to the right in the release flow, the longer some task may take. For instance, if you plan for a summative usability evaluation, it may span multiple Scrum sprints. So the typical approach in Agile is to work on a task until it's done. But for long durations, you might need to accept that some tasks won't be finished within your desired time frame, and must be paused for later. I find that perfectly fine, but you must define in your system how to deal with long duration tasks. In light of release activities, I also want to bring up and mention DevOps because it's used by many SaMD companies. It's perhaps not Agile per se. Well, it's a way to work, which I would say is ending up in an Agile approach. Well, anyway, the release concept I just described doesn't exactly fit into this model. In my experience, DevOps is very much focused on software and often fails to address activities such as validation or human factor engineering, updating instruction for use when used in medical device industry, in the medical device industry. This is something that needs to be managed. One way to mitigate this is to avoid continuous deployment and perhaps stay with continuous delivery, which means introducing a release step before the software is deployed and made available to users. Because in theory, at least, continuous deployment means that it continuously deploys out to the users. And I think that's perhaps not what we want to see in the medical device industry, because we need to, well, ensure that whatever comes after software release, like I showed before, leading up to design and product release, must be updated or at least checked that it's still valid. Another possibility is integrating regulatory operations into the workflow, resulting in something that's called RegOps. The goal is to automate the creation of regulatory documentation in parallel with the software. While it is absolutely a great idea, I recommend exploring it. I'm not convinced it fixes all documentation challenges. I would argue that RegOps is great for documentation likely to change between releases, such as design and test documentation and keeping traceability matrix up to date. However, for documentation that is more static, I believe the traditional approach to documentation might be more effective because you don't need to automate the generation of documents that perhaps will be more static. So, for example, a software architecture may be updated between releases, but for a mature SaMD, well, I guess the updates aren't that frequent. The same goes for software safety classification. If I see an updated classification for each release, honestly, I might wonder if you know what you're doing, because it shouldn't change between the releases. So there are documentation that will be static, and well, then you need to ask yourself, what do we benefit from trying to automate the generation of the more static deliverables? That was perhaps a detour from Agile. So now let's return to the scope of your Agile ambitions. In summary, when deciding the scope of your Agile ambitions, consider suitable constraints and the durations you might need to work with. And even though one size fits most, you might end up in mixing methods for different purposes. For instance, perhaps you would like to choose Scrum for software development and a Kanban approach for design and product release. So again, one size fits most, but you might come to different conclusions. The most important thing when choosing or defining your, let's say, your ambitions, your Agile ambition, is to think through how far you want to take it and make up, let's say, perhaps even simulate the whole release flow to make it work for you. And this leads me to recommend you thinking about the entire product release cycle and not getting too hung up on the software release alone, because there are more things that need to be addressed. Because your Agile ambition might suffer from design and product release activities stealing attention from planned work worked on in the Scrum in the software release. And this is a common pitfall, seeing that design and release or product release activities are stealing and kind of annoying people working perhaps in a sprint. And that breaks Agile ambitions apart. So I pour a bit more tea to fresh my throat. Carl, have I triggered any questions so far, or am I still fine?
You're still you're still fine. We have one person asking here, following cybersecurity best practices, there will probably be a need to maintain SOUP and keep it up to date, to patch for vulnerabilities, issues, etc.
Yep.
How is this typically solved related to activities between the software release and the design release and the product release? Is this something you will address?
Not really. So it's good, perhaps good time to answer to that.
Yeah.
Well, I think, as I've mentioned, as a rule of thumb, you're most likely not hitting any clinical performance, or you're not increasing your risk appetite. In contrary, you're lowering your risk appetite by updating SOUPs. So I would say that when you do an update of SOUPs to address cybersecurity risks, you do a new software release, and you can probably, I'll say probably, have a very fast design release, because the documentation in leading up to the design release won't change really. So it's probably still instruction for you, still the same technical documentation. The validation should be intact and left unchanged. Still, you should confirm that they are valid. So it's an easy design release and an easy product release, but I still think the steps apply even for SOUP updates. I hope I answered to the question. Otherwise, please feel free to write follow-up questions. All good, Carl?
All good, Christian. I really like those slides about introducing those terms of software release vis-a-vis design release and product release. I think they can be super helpful in having a more clear discussion about what a release actually is and entails. And I'm super excited that you're also going to RegOps. Let's see if that is just a fad or if there is really cool things that RegOps can actually solve in the future.
As I said, I definitely think it's a great idea, and a great, not only idea, I think it's a great approach to updating and automating documentation. But as I said, I think that perhaps at least two categories of documentation, which some benefit of the automation work, and some it's questionable whether they really benefit from automating the creation of those documents. Right, let's get going. I better keep up the speed. The next topic that appears to be challenging in many Agile SAM projects is actual requirement traceability. Many SAM projects today are relatively complex with many different software components working together. So you could say they are kind of entangled in the way you're working. It can look at this like this. Your SAM combines an app, backend, web portal, and desktop, and you get regulatory clearance for the top level, the combination. When I conduct audits and ask for design verification and validation, the response is often that people start scrolling up and down in a backlog, complemented by searches in the list of completed tasks to find something that matches what I asked for. And well, now I'm not pointing fingers or trying to, well, accuse people, but keep an eye on this, because you should pretty fast and quick be able to respond to a question like, where's your design validation? And this is not really because I enjoy being mean. This is a cat app, it looks pretty mean. So no, not at all, but I find it relevant to understand how a medical device has been verified and validated. And this also goes back to the design release I mentioned before. So the documentation you have in a design release, they are also kind of subject to both design verification and validation. So keep that in mind. And by the way, my cat is much cuter than this one. Design validation is done in response to what IEC 8234-1 refers to as use requirements or user needs in ISO 13485. If you now consider pointing at user stories commonly used to capture requirements, well, do you want them all to be subject to design validation? I don't think so. So be mindful about that. Instead, I suggest establishing a 3-level structure that supports the identification of different requirements. At the top, we have the use requirements. at the next level, there is a system requirement level that could define capacity requirements or interface specification between subsystems. At the lowest level, you find software requirements relevant to each subsystem. Another way to visualize the structure is through a requirement traceability map, and that could look like this. So here you also see that I've added a hazard trace matrix in the middle, because that is also an essential part of requirement traceability work. A graphical overview like this is often missing, but can provide can prove invaluable when organizing your work. And I would say especially so when working Agile, because many drive everything through the backlog, resulting in a long list of completed work items without identifying what is what. I have no doubt that the work items were placed in the backlog for good reasons. There was a good understanding on how things related. But when I ask about design validation, often the information appears to have gone with the wind. And that's not the way I think you should plan and drive your requirement traceability work. Some Scrum fans might be upset now because I kind of suggest that the backlog should perhaps only have a limited functionality when it comes to requirement management. Because since requirement traceability is crucial when working on medical devices, perhaps requirements should be managed outside our backlog, and you keep the backlog for work items. So the backlog is then refining the requirements into actionable work. If I were asked to set up an Agile software development procedure for a complex SAMD, I think I would go in this direction. I would take this approach. And since we're on this call sharpening your skills, I'm sure Carl and his colleagues are happy to schedule a demo of how Aligned Element can contribute to a setup like this. And Carl, I hope you don't mute me now and say this is not doable, because then I didn't ask you before up front. I got a thumbs up, so I survived that one as well. Great. Well, if you disagree with me and prefer working with a backlog-only approach, I highly recommend identifying a strategy that enables you to distinguish between different layers. Here I have used epics, user stories, and tasks. Perhaps you don't want to include all epics in your design validation. If so, please identify a way to distinguish between the different epics up front, because trust me, you want this to be crystal clear throughout the product life cycle. In summary, I often encounter requirement traceability as a pain point in Agile setups. Perhaps it's only me being sensitive, but if this resonates with you, I recommend you start sketching a traceability architecture, almost like a software architecture, and explore whether you can label work items or give them perhaps even specific IDs to support requirement management. And please don't just dump everything in the backlog and keep your fingers crossed it will work, because, sorry to say, I don't think it will. You need to have support and figure out what is what. So that was a quick glance at requirement management, and two suggestions basically. Either you work with requirement management to set up and use the requirements to refine into the work items, or you try to figure out a way to identify things in your backlog and complete the task list. Carl, are we good?
It looks like everybody's agreeing with you.
That was kind of provocative questions. Or statement.
No, but I don't have any input for you right now. But I look forward to see what questions comes in the next section.
Sure. But the next section is crystal clear. Now we've come to an overwhelmingly popular topic: documentation. To convince others that your product is safe, there is no escape from sharing information with external parties, one way or another. This is typically seen as endless rows of printed paper, but try to think outside of the box and think about information sharing before you envision documents. IEC 6234 is relatively straightforward on this topic. As a manufacturer, it's your decision to decide how to package documentation, or I could even say package information. This is probably one of the standard's most overlooked sentences and a pitfall in many Agile documentation implementations. Because instead of trusting tools to store information, every occurrence of documented or record in IEC 6234 results in a traditional document. And remember the typewriter in the beginning, that's not the way we want it to be. So you do have a bit of flexibility to work and tailor your settings to your liking. And I will give you some tips and tricks on the way to do that. So now you might ask, what information is suitable to keep in tools? Let's look at the process artifacts, or the outputs resulting from a software development process. I call one group of artifacts product documentation, which describes or defines a product. There's also a second group, which I call conformity documentation. And the conformity documentation is evidence of you conforming with your procedures and work instructions. In IEC 6234, most clauses asking you to verify and evaluate are examples of standard requirements resulting in conformity documentation. Now you might wonder why this is relevant. Is it just adding theory and adding a next level of complexity? Well, the answer to that is they have the two types of process artifacts have different audiences and are needed for various purposes. The product documentations is needed to manufacture your product and will also be subject to external reviews during regulatory submissions. This means that information in the product documentation group must be exportable into readable formats outside of your organization. In contrast to conformity documentation, which is typically expected during audits, but is rarely part of external submissions, or what you could say, or at least it shouldn't be. With this in mind, conformity documentation can reside in your tools. So that's an opportunity to explore. You could say that on-site, tools are available for on-site information. You are there to guide, and the subject matter experts can be pulled in to assist if needed. Furthermore, on-site information is likely to be worked on more frequently than on-site information. Sorry, I confused you now. Let's say that again. So the on-site information is likely more worked on compared to the off-site information. And this is important because, well, it may be a source of waste, because imagine the difference between reviewing and collaborating on requirements in a requirement management tool instead of using traditional documents. So if you can run what's called in IEC 6234 verify requirements, if you can do that within a tool, you can add comments directly to the requirement management tool. You can perhaps bundle, you can label, you can group requirements, and you can place comments to those, everything in the tool. I think that will be much faster than exporting everything to Excel or Word, and perhaps even signing approving documents and route them for review, and you have multiple copies of paperwork. Well, I guess you get the idea. If we compare with offsite, so one typical characteristic of offsite information is that it must be presentable without your tools, and sometimes formatted following specific guidelines. So even though all information should always be self-explanatory, it is crucial for offsite information to be that. So you're not there to help, and you must spend a lot more information on making it presentable, perhaps even visually appealing. So there are really differences in the two types. See where we are. So with this picture in mind, I hope you feel inspired to explore what conformity documentation you can keep in your tools and avoid a pitfall of creating traditional documents where it's not really necessary. This, of course, all assumes that you can spend the time needed to validate your tools to keep the information. But I think if you look into the cost of having everything in documents, traditional documents, compared to validating a couple of tools, I think you will see it will pay off, especially when working in an agile environment. So, and if you want a helping hand how this can be done, you can use a modified compliance checklist with columns or adding a couple of columns, identifying the type of process record and share your stance on how you want to work. Here I have added process record, product compliance. I've added a couple of comment suggestions. And by the way, this is a work in progress, so please excuse any spelling errors. I'm working on this as having it as a generic template, and that's perhaps an interest for this audience. Let's see if you're interested, place comments in the chat, and we can see how we can make that work. So that was a theoretical discussion, perhaps. Perhaps you felt it was far away from being agile, but I think if you explore the options to, well, look into the options of seeing what is compliance documentation versus product documentation, it might help you to perhaps, well, downsize and eliminate some waste in your traditional documentation work. Carl, I can see in your face, you're thinking, is that what the heck did it just say?
No, it's I 100% agree with you that writing something down in a document will incur cost, and that is very, very undervalued. You know, that people don't realize this. As soon as they write down something in a document, you need to babysit this document for the rest of the lifetime of the product, and it will keep incurring costs. So if you can keep information out of documents and into tools, there is a financial upside to this. Now, the chat just exploded in questions here. So Brian is asking about the slides. Brian wants the slides. This is a recorded session. We place a recording, so you have on YouTube and our website, so you definitely have access to that. The slides themselves, Christian, are you using them in your training?
Some of these I'm using in training, and to be really transparent, I have more or less writer's block for 2 years, but I'm now back in business and trying to work on a new course, which will be Agile implementation in medical device software, and how to meet IC 234 in an Agile implementation. So,
yeah, we have several people here interested in the template. You can reach out to them in the chat and see who they are. And then I'm going to read out another question here for Primoz. I came across this idea as a kind of symbiosis of 6234 and Scrum. I was thinking of this idea of having SWDP, is this a thing? Software development process, as a base for retrospectives within Scrum from time to time and discuss ways of working there. And this would help with keeping it up to date and facilitate discussions on improving how we work. Do you find this reasonable?
Yeah, and we're shortly coming to that. Yeah. So if you're working Scrum and you have a retrospective, I think retrospective is really there to see, can we improve our way of working? Are we performing as we want to? And I would even take it even further and say, yes, I think you can update your plans to improve, but I would even encourage you to see if you can improve your procedure. Because it's that's what it's all about. Being agile is to try to improve and find new efficient ways of working. And if you find something that can be improved and not violating, let's say, regulatory requirements or the standard you claim compliance to, by all means, I think you definitely should.
Yeah. Okay, we got to hurry up.
Yeah. All right. I'll try to wrap up things as quick as I can. So, is your QMS supportive? So we're approaching the end, and the last pitfall I recommend you avoid: having procedures that are not user-friendly. When talking about software development procedures, the primary users are the developers. It's not those reading the procedures when you get audited a few times per year. Unfortunately, most procedures I have seen are strictly V-model based, but allow Agile. The problem is that you have a procedure telling one story, but most of your projects are doing something else. This is a poll I did a couple of weeks, perhaps a month ago. It's only 51 votes. I still think I was impressed to see clean Agile implementation with 25%. So let's look at the definition of a procedure. It defines a specific way to carry out an activity or a process. And process is a set of interrelated or interacting activities that use inputs to deliver an intended result. So if you want to hit the bullseye with your agile ambitions, your procedure should define activities and processes you want the dev team to follow. You should not describe anything else. So I would argue that everything else isn't good enough, and strictly speaking, perhaps even a non-conformity of your quality management system, because your procedure does not specify how to carry out an activity or a process. An excellent guidance document is TIR 45 from Amy, which provides much food for thought when using agile practices in a regulated environment. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend you should. However, it is a guidance document. It doesn't detail how you should do it in your organization. So TR 45 is a holy grail for agile advocates, but you must unleash the power yourself. So where I'm going with this is I suggest your procedures has the developers as the primary intended audience. The procedure should guide and help with sprint planning, execution, review, retrospectives. So this is the content I would recommend you to have. If you work in Scrum, if you work in Kanban, clearly that should say something else. But a developer should be able to go and read about what am I supposed to do in sprint planning? What should happen? And to help people unfamiliar with the terminology, you could consider adding a process summary in the procedure, bridging your chosen development approach and traditional medical device terminology. An obvious drawback is, of course, that you might struggle with how to demonstrate compliance with the standard IEC 62304. But what is most valuable, as I said before, everyday work or when you get audited a few times per year? I might be naive, but I believe you can get both. Focus on those expected to read the standard the procedure most, and create an annex where you provide a cross-reference where the various requirements are dealt with throughout your procedure. And this approach should take you through most audits without problems, because you will succeed in audits because your developers comply with the procedure, because they understand what's in it, and the cross-reference in an annex like this ensures you are always audit ready. Honestly, isn't that awesome? Or what do you say, Carl? I'm not auditing you today, but if you audit yourself, does your software development procedure specify your way of working agile? And now we're back to where we started. My apologies if I caused your homework revising your software development procedure.